The National Association of Realtors recently settled a huge class action lawsuit that is dramatically going to change how real estate is done, not only in California, but throughout the United States. So in this video, we're going to talk about one, what was the lawsuit all about to begin with? Two, what was the end result of the lawsuit? And three, how is this going to impact the real estate market? And who is it going to hurt or benefit? Buyers, sellers, realtors? Well, we're going to talk about it. So let's get to it. My name's Rich Fleming. I am your local San Francisco East Bay realtor, and I'm here to teach you everything you need to know about living, working, playing, sleeping, eating, transitioning to, transitioning from, investing, buying real estate in the San Francisco Bay Area. So if you've got questions, that's what I'm here for. Feel free to reach out to me or set up a consultation appointment. In the description below is the contact information. So let's start off with how the real estate model worked, as far as who the parties were, what their contractual relationship were, and how the different agents involved in the transaction got paid. So as I noted in the opening of this video, there's been a lot of stuff in the media about the recent NAR, the National Association of Realtor settlement. Some of the reporting has been better than others, but that's always the case. You see headlines like this, the NAR commission settlement details revealed, judge approves multi-million-dollar realtor settlement. But most importantly for you, what does it mean as either a home buyer and home seller? And that's what we're going to cover in today's video. So let's talk about what the old compensation for real estate agents looked like. What was the model? And for most people, when they bought a home, the process was, hey, I want to buy a home. I find an agent, we look, we negotiate, do all the rest of that, and I end up with a home. Nowhere in that process typically did the home buyer really understand or necessarily even be informed as to how their agent was being compensated, right? They never usually signed a document saying they had any kind of legal agreement with their agent. Didn't have to make any payments, didn't have to leave a deposit or any kind of retainer. And there probably was no specific fee pointed out to the home buyer in the process about how their agent was getting paid or how much they were getting paid. It didn't necessarily even show up in their closing documents, which, that was pretty typical. So how did the agent get paid? Well, the agent was paid typically out of the seller's proceeds from the home sale, right? And this process kind of, for the most part, happened automatically. There wasn't necessarily a whole lot of negotiation between the buyer's agent and the seller for this. The home buyer themselves probably wasn't aware of this compensation at all. So this is how the model used to work. And when you really want to get into the details as to how it worked, when someone decided to sell their home, they would find an agent to help them, prepare their home and market it. And as part of that, the seller's agent would set up a compensation schedule. In other words, Mr. Seller, how much are you willing to compensate myself to help you sell the home? And in most parts of the country, I would say somewhere between 5 and 6% was typical. But, here in the Bay Area, you would sometimes see 1% or zero, no compensation. So it really varied. But how that compensation was structured and the flexibility of it really varied throughout the country. So that was set up, and then the home buyer and their agent were out looking. They find the perfect home. They negotiate and start the process of buying. The home buyer pays the home seller between their down payment and the money they get from their mortgage company. And in exchange, the home buyer gets the home. And once that transaction was completed, the selling agent, or their brokerage to be more accurate, would take a portion of what they earned from the home seller and pay it to the buyer's agent, right? And this was all done using what's known as the multiple listing service. It's online. Basically, if you use Zillow, Redfin, anything, that's the online service they're using to pull the information about the homes to display to you online. So all of this was handled using that multiple listing service. There are numbers of multiple listing services throughout the country, but that's how the model worked. So, what was the problem with this system? Well, the claimed problem with the system was uh, attorneys and some sellers argued that the rules and some from the National Association of Realtors and some multiple listing services mandated that the seller had to provide compensation to the buyer's agent. It wasn't a point of negotiation. If you wanted to use any service, you had to do this. And then some MLSs, it was alleged, even essentially fixed a fee, that the amount of the fee. The other aspect was there was no transparency. As I mentioned, buyers often didn't know all of this compensation was going on in the background, or the amount of the compensation. So that's what generated the lawsuit, the NAR lawsuit. So let's talk a little bit about the allegations. The lawsuit, the name of it was the Spitzer-Burnett, two different cases, I believe, but they kind of got combined, if I recall correctly. But it was a class action lawsuit. Who were the parties? So Spitzer and Burnett were the original people filing the case. It got a class action, which means it starts to represent tens of thousands and so on of people in a class, or homeowners essentially. And it was against the National Association of Realtors, but not only the National Association, it was against the large real estate brokerage companies, Remax, Anywhere, and you may not have heard of Anywhere. Well, Anywhere is a holding company of real estate brokerages. So they own Coldwell Banker, they own Better Homes, they own Century 21, and they own some other brands too. But Anywhere is the entity over all those brands. Berkshire Hathaway Home Services, they're very big throughout the country. Keller Williams, those were the primary companies involved in the case. So the plaintiffs were alleging the guidelines requiring compensation were anti-competitive. They felt that the way the system was set up and the rules was forcing sellers to overpay for commission to both their agent and, more importantly, to the buyer's agent. Buyers don't have an opportunity to negotiate with their agent to get a lower commission amount, right? Because that commission amount was being set by the seller and their agent, and it was just automatically, a portion of it was just automatically being given to the buyer's agent. So the argument is, hey, if the buyer has an opportunity to negotiate ahead of time with the commission for their agent, then that should lower the cost throughout the entire system, right? And there was also a claim that the NAR and these other major companies, that the other major brokerages, really have policies and procedures that really discouraged agents from competing on price. So those were the allegations. So what happened? Well, went to court and a jury found in favor of the plaintiffs, the homeowners. And the way antitrust law works, at least my understanding of it, is under certain circumstances, if you as a defendant lose, you could be subject to what's called treble damages, basically tripling of the damages. So that $1.8 billion award could have been increased to up to 5.4 billion by the judge if they thought treble damages were appropriate. So that was the result. I believe that was in late 2023, around October, November 2023. So, but what ended up happening ultimately? Well, yes, the plaintiffs won the suit. And the defendants said, hey, for as much as potentially $5.6 billion, we are going to take this to appeal. So why did they settle then? Why did both sides decide to settle the suit instead of continuing on in court? Well, both sides had incentive to settle, right? The defendants, their motivation was, hope to settle for far less than the amount awarded. So instead of being at risk of potentially 5.4 billion or even 2 or 3 billion, they're hoping to settle for significantly less than that. And that goes to the, avoiding the treble damages. The other aspect is it's just time consuming and expensive to appeal. It's more lawyer fees, more time, more management focus, things like that. The plaintiff's incentive to settle was to avoid the cost of and the potential loss of the appeal, right? So that's more money the plaintiffs are spending, and essentially the plaintiff's lawyers, because most plaintiffs don't have the money to fund this. So the lawyers are funding this, and they're risking, hey, if it goes to appeal and we lose, we get nothing. Now that they won the original case, they don't want to risk going to appeal if they can help it. Reduce the likelihoods of the defendants becoming insolvent. So the National Association of Realtors is a huge organization, has hundreds of thousands of members, but it is not a for-profit organization. If they were forced to pay billions of dollars, they might file bankruptcy. Some of the brokerages might file bankruptcy. So the plaintiffs definitely don't want to go into bankruptcy court because they may only get pennies on their dollars and it may take them years to get it. And finally, they want their payments faster, right? If you go into appeal or there is bankruptcy, it could take years to get the payments that the plaintiffs have won. By settling, they might be able to get their whatever funds they can get much faster in a much more organized and immediate way. So that was the incentive. So they did end up settling, and the amounts they settled for were the National Association of Realtors ended up settling for 418 million. Remax, I believe, settled for 55 million. Anywhere settled for 83.5 million. Berkshire, 250 million, and they own a lot of brokerages and things like that. So I believe that amount is correct. And Keller settled for 70 million. And these are just some of the companies. So these were the major companies that were originally targeted. But basically, every large real estate brokerage in the country, every large real estate brand ended up settling this so they could avoid being sued themselves in the future. So companies like Compass settled for 57 million, Redfin about 9.25 million, and there are probably 10 to 15 more companies that settled for various amounts. So not only did they settle for money, but they are also agreed to have changes in their business practices. So the National Association of Realtors and these brokerages agreed to change their business practices. So we're going to get into that in a little while and talk about that, but that was really the result of the lawsuit. So now the real question is, how is this going to impact you when you're buying a house or potentially selling a house? So there are new business practices which were a result of this lawsuit. It's being mandated by this lawsuit, and they go into effect August 17th. So as when I'm filming this, we're a few days away from that August 17th date, but the new rules go into effect on that Saturday. So even if you have been working with a real estate agent or talking to one, the rules and what's going to happen, the process is changing for everyone August 17th. So here are the requirements for the settlement. The NAR and affiliated associations, MLSs, cannot require sellers to compensate buyers' agents. They can't do that anymore. Seller concessions to pay buyer compensation is fully negotiable. Fully negotiable. That's the major result, especially from a seller's point of view, that is coming out of this. All buyers must sign a buyer's representation agreement to view homes. So now you have to have a contractual relationship with your agent as a buyer. And it doesn't matter, if I'm not going to buy for 6 months, do I still have to sign this? Yes. If you're looking at homes, you still have to sign some type of representation agreement. Okay. Even to visit open houses, now you have to sign in and stating, hey, I'm coming to the open house, and by visiting, I am not establishing any kind of agency relationship with the agent hosting the open house. So there is just more notification, clarification, and disclosure required for home buyers or those in the home buying market. Seller paid compensation amounts cannot appear on the MLS. So that is the system, as I think I briefly mentioned, where the Zillows, the Redfins, and all agents really get their information about what's on the market. They get it from the MLS. There used to be fields that agents could see about what the compensation would be as a buyer's agent for this property. So uh, that is no longer appearing. And one of the reasons for that is it was claimed that for if the compensation was appearing and some sellers were offering no compensation while others were offering 3% compensation, there would be steering towards those higher compensation properties. So they removed that. So let's talk about buyer impact specifically. As I mentioned, each buyer now has to have a written representation agreement with the agent they are working with, and the agreement must specify the following things. So it must specify the duration of the agreement. And in California, the maximum is 90 days. It can be renewed after 90 days, but it cannot exceed 90 days. Maximum compensation must be shown on the agreement. This does not mean that the agent cannot agree to take less than this amount, but this is the maximum amount they can get paid under any circumstance as part of representing a buyer. Geographic area. So it needs to say, hey, these cities are what is covered in this agreement, or counties or whatever geographic area. And the reason this exists is, hey, I'm looking in San Francisco, and maybe I'm working with an agent who specializes in San Francisco, but I'm also considering Berkeley, and I want to work with an agent who specializes in Berkeley. So by limiting the geographic area or defining the geographic area, it makes it easier for consumers to be able to work with multiple agents that have expertise in certain areas. Types of properties. So you can specify a home, a single family home, condos, townhomes, 4-unit buildings. And the reason this exists is because a buyer may work with a specific agent if they do real estate investing in a certain location, and they want that agent to only handle their investment property, but they're looking for a home for themselves and they want to use a different agent. So by specifying the types of buildings, they can basically work with the agent that fits their needs the best. All agents are prohibited from showing properties unless there is a representation agreement. Okay, this is not just a couple of agents or one company or another. Basically, any agent that is a realtor, a member of the National Association of Realtors, which is probably in the residential world, probably 98, 99% of agents. They have to have this. You will not be able to see properties unless you have this agreement. The agreement now makes the buyer, not the seller, which was kind of in the previous model, but the buyer responsible for their agent's compensation. Now, that doesn't mean that the buyer is going to have to pay out of pocket, but they are responsible for it. All right. So if there isn't payment by some other method at the close, then the buyer would be responsible. But typically, I'm going to say the buyer is not going to have to pay directly, or at least all of the compensation directly. Okay. So as I mentioned, by agreement, now the buyer is responsible for figuring out how their agent gets compensated. So there are really two ways that the compensation for the buyer's agent can be addressed. One is negotiating with the seller as part of the home purchase negotiations for the seller to take some of their proceeds and pay the buyer's agent. So that is essentially how the model worked before. However, it is a clear and specific negotiation between the parties for that to happen. It is not just something that kind of happens in the background anymore. The second way is for the buyer to pay their agent directly. So, hey, if there are $10,000 in fees, a commission due to the buyer's agent, the buyer can choose to bring in that additional funds at the close of the purchase so that their agent gets paid. Now, you can combine these two, so maybe the seller will pay a portion, the buyer pays a portion of the compensation, but between these two methods, the buyer is responsible for making sure the agent's compensation is paid. So this is a different model than has been going on. And it really puts that onus on the buyer to make sure that the compensation is being addressed as part of the transaction. Buyers did not have to do that before. So I have the wrong title up here, but that's okay. So this is how the model works now going forward. So the seller works with their agent and they discuss commission only for the seller's agent. The buyer now negotiates with their agent and negotiate compensation only for their agent. And then the process of negotiating back and forth for the home begins. But part of the negotiations are, will the seller help the buyer compensate the buyer's agent? That is a matter of negotiation now. It is not mandated. Now, once that happens, then if the seller does agree to pay some or all of their agent, the buyer essentially takes that concession from the home seller and channels it to their agent at the close of escrow through the escrow company or an attorney or what have you to make this happen. All right. So that pass through of compensation from the seller's agent to the buyer's agent no longer really exists. Each party negotiates directly with their agent, then they negotiate on how the buyer's agent is to be compensated, the source of that compensation. The buyer's responsible. That is the big change here. And quite honestly, the market for buyers has been very difficult in recent years. Well, this is something else that buyers now have to think about and be aware of. What if I don't have the extra funds to pay my agent directly? Well, you as a buyer can choose to only look at homes where the seller is willing to fully compensate your agent, right? Or you can go out and instead of having your own agent, you can go to the seller's agent and say, hey, will you help me buy this so I don't have to hire my own agent? This is not desirable for a couple of reasons I'm going to talk about, but it is something you can do. The third thing is you can represent yourself and say, hey, I'm just going to do the investigations, paperwork, everything myself and not compensate an agent. And this is very risky. If you don't have some type of, expertise or especially time to go through all the documentation and understand what it's telling you, you are taking on responsibility for, this purchase without a whole bunch of knowledge. So not something I would recommend, but it is something you can do. So let's talk about the pros and cons of each of these. Going to see properties where the seller is willing to pay compensation for the buyer's agent. Well, the pros of that is, hey, I can afford more home because, all of my funds are going to go towards the down payment. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit more. I'm going to explain it a little bit more in a couple of seconds. Less financial strain when I'm buying a home, and you get full representation. You get an advocate, someone who's going to negotiate and fight for you, make sure you're getting best deal. The drawback is they're going to be somewhat less homes to see. Now, is that going to be, hey, I can't see 90% of the homes on the market? Probably not. But I'm going to guess maybe 10% of the market you may not be able to qualify for if that 10% of home sellers isn't willing to pay your agent, right? So let's talk about the pros and cons of working with the seller's agent. Well, you might be more likely to get the property because, hey, this is a motivation for the seller's agent. But they're really supposed to work in the best interest of their client. And then agent fees might be less. They might charge you less for the fees depending on what the situation is. But here are the cons, and you have to really pay attention to these. You are likely to pay a fee to the seller's agent. They're not going to represent you or help you with the paperwork for free. So how much you're really going to save by going to the seller's agent is highly questionable. It's something you have to make sure you understand before you start working with the seller's agent and get it in writing. Not all seller agents will work with buyers. So some brokerages actually prohibit that type of activity. And even if they don't, not all agents want to do that because it can often lead to lawsuits. So some agents just go, hey, you have to go and get your own agent. The major thing, even if an agent will work with you, a listing agent, a seller's agent, they are not going to advocate nor negotiate on your behalf. Their primary client is the seller. So they will help you do the paperwork. They will help you understand the documentation you're signing, but they're not going to advocate for your position. They are not going to recommend either repairs or price negotiation. They are simply going to help you through the process of buying the house. So you don't, even though they're helping you through the process, they're not looking out, for lack of a better term, your best interest. They are only making sure that they are legally telling you what everything they're supposed to about the house. And you have to do this for every home. You would have to do this for every home you're interested in looking at. And like I said, not all seller agents will do this. So you may not be able to purchase some of their homes. Buying a home without representation, the real driving force to do this is to save money. Minimal cost to you. You can hire companies that'll just do the paperwork for you. They don't do anything else for you, but they'll fill in the boxes on the paperwork. But the drawback, you don't have anyone to explain things to you or advocate for you. You are at a significant disadvantage if you do try and negotiate. To be honest, if you as a novice person in the real estate world try to negotiate with me, I'm probably going to win that negotiation because I do this all day, every day for the last 20 years. So I just have an advantage over you. You're also not going to get any advice on mortgages and financing, things like that. And you pretty much can only see homes during open houses. So those are the pros and cons of, these three options. So let's talk a little bit more about the economics and why a seller may want to pay for the buyer agent compensation. They have financial incentive to do so. Those that don't often get focused on, I just don't want to pay the other person's agent, even though economically they're better off doing so. So in this quick assumptions that I'm offering here, hey, a buyer has $100,000 available for all home purchasing expenses, and we'll just assume the only two expenses are down payment and paying their agent. And most people, whatever pool of money they have to buy the home, that's it. They don't have a spare $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, a spare $10,000. Usually most people have a defined pool of money that they can spend in purchasing a home. And we'll also assume that the home buyer is approved for 80-20 financing. That means you bring in 20%, the mortgage company gives you 80%. So for every $1 you bring in, the mortgage company gives you $4 to purchase the home. So in scenario A, where the seller says, hey, I'm not going to pay the buyer's agent, buyer really wants the house, they say, cool, I will pay $10,000 to my agent. Now, because the buyer only had that $100,000, that means they only have $90,000 for down payment. The bank loan will now be $360,000. Where did I get that from? 90 times 4. Remember, for every $1 the buyer brings in, the bank gives you 4. So 4 times 90 is 360. You add 90 and 360 together, the maximum price that the home buyer can afford for the home is $450,000, right? Scenario B, seller says, you know what, I'll pay the $10,000 to the buyer's agent. Buyer says, great, that makes my life simpler. I have a full $100,000 now for my down payment. Well, bank says, great, you put in $100,000, we'll give you $4 for every $1 you put in. That means $400,000. The total amount that the buyer can now afford to pay for that home is $500,000. $100,000 down payment, $400,000 mortgage, add those together, $500,000. So the buying power of the buyer goes up by $50,000 because this seller is willing to spend $10,000 towards the buyer agent compensation. What this really means is that the seller, in doing this, is allowing the buyer to finance the cost of their agent in the purchase price of the home. That's what is happening there. And this gives sellers the ability to attract more people who can now afford their home, and those people they attract can afford to pay more for the home. So that's the financial incentive that sellers often have in many areas, not all. Some areas are so competitive they can still get maximum price without paying the buyer's agent, but in most areas this is going to be the case. The other reason that it's important for sellers to consider paying the buyer's agent compensation is they are competing against other sellers. It is not just all about what that one individual seller, right? So if you have two homes, they're across the street from each other in a community, they're identical models. Home A is listed at 500, home B is listed at 500, but home A is making the buyer pay their own agent directly, whereas home B says, hey, I will pay the agent out of my funds. Well, if you are a buyer, which home are you going to see and try to buy? What is in your best interest, not the seller's interest, but what is in your best interest as a home buyer? Well, hey, it's better for me to be able to finance and not have to take this cash out of my pocket, right? I can finance it. So even though home seller A wants to keep that extra $10,000 and that's what they want to do, well, that doesn't mean every buyer is going to go to them. The buyer is more likely to go to home B and compete for home B and drive up the price of home B while home A sits there. So sellers have to know they're not only looking at how this works with individual buyers, but buyers in and of themselves are making a decision about which homes they are more interested in because of this. What do buyers think agents do? And most people think, hey, home buyers, I work with an agent and my agent takes me to see homes. We submit an offer. In about 3 weeks, I get a new home and the agent gets paid. That is, what most people think their agent does. And there's a lot more to it. So really the agent is kind of the focal point for the home buyer in many aspects of the home buying process. So first of all, I've got to teach you about what's going on in the market because most people don't follow it nearly as in depth as a real estate agent. They don't know the national trends. They don't know the specific area market trends. Then work with you to figure out, hey, what given your situation, who might be some of the best mortgage companies? Please never just go online and get a quote unquote pre-approval online. Just don't do it. Okay. I'm not even going to go there. You go out and view homes. You submit offers and negotiate with the seller, maybe on 2 or 3 different offers, depending on how competitive the market is. You go and do property inspections or review the property inspections and understand what shape is the home is, what's the risk of buying the home as far as repairs are concerned, how much might you have to invest in fixing things, or what kind of repairs should you request for. There is a ton of work, especially in California, very litigious state, unfortunately, so there is a lot of paperwork to prepare. And to review this paperwork with the home buyer, make sure the most important items are really being called out to the home buyer. And then you get your new home. All of this stuff is really filtered through the agent, and the agent helps the home buyer understand what's going on in each segment as far as the process goes. So given that a home buyer now needs to sign an agreement and make sure that their agent gets compensated, now the agents need to be able to show the value to the home buyer of what they're providing. So what should you look for in an agent? So definitely market knowledge. And I'm going to tell you, don't confuse market knowledge with experience. And experience is the agent who says, hey, I've been doing this 30 years. That's why you want to work with me. I know agents who've only been in this business for maybe 2 or 3 years who have a lot of knowledge and a lot of know-how of what is going on in the market, how to serve their clients, and they are far better than some agents that have been doing this 20 or 30 years. So really focus on that knowledge. The second thing is negotiation skills and experience. I generally feel that you want both parties, buyer and seller, to walk away feeling pretty good about the transaction, hopefully very positive about the transaction. But it really depends on what your negotiating style is. So if you're a person who is, hey, I like to hammer on everything, and you look at it as a zero sum type of event, then you need to find an agent that operates like that. If you're more of, hey, I want this to go smoothly, I don't want there to be bitterness, I don't want a lot of anxiety on everyone's behalf, I want a fair deal that works well, but not a ton of stress, then that's a different negotiating style. So you need to find a different type of agent. And then just what services they provide. It's not just as simple as opening doors and filling out contracts. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but I actually provide my clients with kind of a list of services I provide, which are different from the typical agent. And, a good agent will have something like that that explains what they do that is different from the typical agent. So you can understand the value of the services that your buyer agent is providing you. One of the most important things, especially here in California, is really summarizing the disclosures and reports, because that tells you about the house, the risk you're taking on in buying the house. And it's not 100% perfect process, but most people do not understand the ins and outs of the disclosures and reports. It's just a whole bunch of paper to most people. If the agent isn't taking the time to explain it to you, that is a big red flag. So I actually kind of summarize disclosures and reports for people, and you should be looking for an agent that is really going to walk you through what that means. So at the end of the day, how's all this going to shake out? Well, here's what I think. I think buyer's agent commissions may decrease, at least temporarily. And there's some evidence of this. There have been a couple of studies over the last 6 months or so that says that the buyer's agent commission is ticking down a little bit, from about 2.6% down to about 2.5%. But will this last? Well, I don't know. If more agents are feeling, hey, I can't make the compensation I need to stay in this business, what you're going to start to see is
people leaving the business of being a real estate agent and fewer agents out there. And if it gets too much, then there are only going to be a relatively small number of agents out in any given market. And when you see that and there's not as much individual competition, then you either see these agents start to form up as into teams, or you start to see less and less price competition, which will drive up the commission rate. Anytime you have consolidation in a market, you tend to see higher prices. So that's something that could happen. Fewer sellers will offer concessions initially. There's been a lot of media attention about this. Sellers are, some sellers are like, great, I don't have to pay the other person's agent and I'm not going to do it. But market experience will teach sellers that it's to their advantage most of the time to pay the buyer's agent. It is to their advantage for the financial reasons we covered before, and it's to their advantage for the timing reason, how long it takes them to sell their home. Because if they aren't offering concessions and everyone else in the neighborhood is, guess whose home is going to sit on the market? So buyer's agents will compete more on the services they provide, and they need to be able to articulate that. They got to know the market trends, neighborhoods, the cities, mortgage lending option, negotiation style, communication style, and frequencies, so you're not left in the dark. So at the end of the day, the new requirements aren't the end of the world for buyers, in my opinion, but they are making the buyer take on specific responsibility for the compensation of their agent. That doesn't mean you as a buyer have to directly pay your agent, but you have to make sure that they are being compensated one way or another. That wasn't the case before. And as a buyer, that's the biggest change of the NAR settlement.
So if you have questions about anything I covered in this video, or just have general Bay Area or real estate questions, that's why I do these videos. Feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is in the video description below. I have previously done a video on the top mortgage mistakes that buyers make in getting and paying off their mortgages. So I will link that video somewhere on this page. I never know where it's going to pop up. If you've got questions, once again, reach out to me. Thanks for your time, and I will catch you in the next video.